Hey, Mackenzie.
How are ya?
How are ya?
I'm good. How are you?
I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Oh, maybe I need to turn up my volume. That's what it is.
Oh, okay.
I'm working on a different computer. I brought my big screen up.
I gotcha.
Oh, yeah, there you are. Hello. Hey, Nidra, how are you? I need to check where Oby is. Hold on a second. Let me check with Imani. Other people will probably be jumping on really quickly.
Sure.
But we need to value their time because it's 11 o'clock and we had an appointment 11 o'clock, right? So welcome.
This is crazy.
That's right. So everybody welcome. Today we have one of our preferred vendors from Inspector RX, and Oby Arnold is awesome. He does a lot of training in our market center, and he's here to talk about inspections, what you should know about an inspection and how it can help you with working with your clients. So Oby, I'm just going to let you take it away. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to being able to go over some of the things to expect during an inspection. Not just the inspection process, but before preparing for an inspection is just as important. So I'll go through that as well. The first thing, I'm going to use my notes here, but the first thing that I would recommend, because here's why it's important. Sometimes you'll be a listing agent, and sometimes you might be a buyer agent. And if you're a listing agent, this is information that you'll want to explain to your customer to make the inspection go by more smoothly. And I think the first thing I would recommend is to clean the house. And what I mean by that is if you've got a lot of towels and things under the bathroom sink, you want to remove those. If there are closets that are really packed full, especially if there's an inspection item that I need to see, it's important to go ahead and clean those out, because as inspectors, we are taught not, we don't move things around. Generally, every once in a while, some things can happen. It can cause a leak because you hit something. We just recommend that everything already be in viewable condition. So like I said, if you've got towels like under the kitchen sink, if you've got a lot of soap suds and things under there, remove them so that we can have a good view of it. And what we'll be doing is looking with a flashlight to see if we see any leaks or anything like that. We want to be able to view the plumbing system and make sure P-traps are there. So that's one of the things that I would recommend is cleaning the house. Like I said, under sinks and closets and things like that. Next thing is be on time. If you're a listing agent, tell your customer that you want to be ready about 30 minutes ahead of time, because what we try to do is we want to be at the home 15 minutes ahead of schedule. I mean, before, if it's 9 o'clock, we want to be there at 8:45. So not that we're going to just start immediately, but we want them to be ready so that we can start at 9 o'clock. Last thing one of the things I don't like to do, especially if it's an occupied house, is to start going through the backyard. I've got my binoculars looking at the roof and things like that, looking for flashing, and I don't want to get flashed by somebody taking a shower because they didn't expect us to be there. So I'm not going to generally start early, but I do want them to be, at 9 o'clock so that we can get started. And that's just not just us, that's any inspection company. Make sure that the utilities are turned on, especially if it's a vacant house. People want to save money and they'll turn them off and then they'll have them turned back on again. You just want to make sure that they're turned on, because the one thing I hate doing is say unable to inspect because the water wasn't turned on. Then that means there might have to be another trip to come out there to do a re-inspect. So just make sure the utilities are turned on. Also, you want to make sure that inspectors have access to the water heater and to the electrical panel especially if it's in the garage. When I'm in a garage, and I know they're moving, I know a lot of times they're in the process of moving their boxes and things like that. But I always joke with people, if I break a $2 garage sale piece of glass, all of a sudden it becomes an irreplaceable family heirloom. So, inspectors we don't need to be moving boxes around, especially heavy items like that where we could break something. And in some inspectors, I'm going to try my best to get access to it, but some inspectors will just look at it, take a picture and say, can't inspect because. And we don't want to do that. I don't like it. I hate doing that, actually. I want to be able to have access to the electrical panel or the water heater as well. Same with, let's see, yes, same with in the attic, in the basement, in the garage. You've got a lot of moving boxes and things like that. You want to go ahead and give us space so that we can look at the walls, make sure everything looks fine there. Maybe if you can leave 2 feet, that'd be great. I can get behind there and see if there's any termite damage or if there's any water leaks or any issues going on with the walls. A termite inspection company, when they come out to do one, if you need a letter, they won't be able to provide it because they didn't have access to see the walls, whether that be in the basement or the garage. So we want to make sure that we have room to be able to get through that. The next thing I would say is pilot lights. Most inspectors are taught not to light a pilot light. So if I go in and I'm testing the fireplace, if that doesn't work, if it's not on, I tend to try to do it. I'll tend to turn on a pilot light. That's my personal preference because, like I said, don't want to say, oh, can't inspect, do to. I don't like that. But, I need to have access to it. It's really nice when I go in and I see that the pilot light is lit. I'll just turn it on and test it, and that's what we're really supposed to do at that point, is just test it to make sure that it is operational. And it should be in a ready for inspection. Some water heater is not turned on. And like I said, most inspectors will just say pilot light is not lit, unable to inspect, because it is a liability issue if you turn it on and something happened, as an inspector. So everything should be ready for inspection during that time. So that's important to make sure that pilot lights are lit. And that, like I said, can be the water heater, a furnace, or a fireplace. If there are rooms that are locked, then make sure that the homeowner has the keys available so that the inspector can access. Might be a room. Sometimes we'll see a room that's locked, and for one reason or another, we need to be able to get in there. Once again, I hate to say unable to inspect because the room was locked. So just make sure they have a key, especially if we're inspecting outbuildings. You want to make sure that if that outbuilding, it either needs to be unlocked or have a key to access it so we can do the inspection of an outbuilding. Another thing too is I would recommend explaining to the customer, the seller, that you want to remove a lot of the debris that might be stacked up against the house. It might be under a deck or on the side of a house. The reason is you want to, especially on the outside, I'm looking for, is there ground contact? Does the siding go below ground or is it above ground? Are there termites? I'm looking for that as well. So if there's a lot of debris up against the house, number one, I can't see it, so therefore I can't comment on it. And number two, that could be a cause for termites, especially like a wood pile for a fireplace or something like that. Leaves and things like that. You want to keep them just away from the house and or at least clean them up away from the house. Next thing is if they've had repairs done to the house, might be a new roof or a roof. If you can have documents there in a folder, I really like it when I see, this was repaired and it has a warranty on it, then I can comment on that. And I'll say in the report, I noticed this, however, there is a warranty, recommend repair. There is a warranty on it, or it was repaired and everything looks fine. So I really like seeing repair documents if they're available. And some people do keep good and meticulous records. The next thing is the homeowner should expect to be gone for about 3 hours. I generally can inspect a house generally 2.5 hours. But then I like to spend that next 15, 20, 30 minutes going through the report, doing the summary with the prospective buyer to see if, make sure they understand what they're buying. That's important. I like having the customer there because I can see on their face if they're going, oh my gosh, this is terrible. This is what a handyman starts their day doing. So for that reason, it's not it's important, I think, to have not necessarily the buyer agent, because they're pretty knowledgeable about everything. It's important. It is nice to have them there because everybody now understands, but especially having the homeowner there. And I would say toward the end of the inspection would be nice because, give the inspector time to do their work. They're concentrating on things, and then they can do that summary once the homeowners get there.
So Oby, this is Julie. So you would say what, like the last half hour or so of the inspection?
I would, if it's scheduled from 2 to 5, actually, if they can get there between 4:30. It depends on the house. I can do a 30 square foot house and it'll take me a full 3 hours. Or I could do a 4,000 square foot house and it takes me 2.5. It just depends on the condition of the house. So if you know that the house has been cared for, it's been fully remodeled or something like that, 4:30 is fine. But if it looks like, it's a rehab or just hasn't been updated, there's going to be a lot of things that would, certainly then I'd say, 4:30, because 2.5 hours, I could probably get that done and give them 30 minutes worth of summary.
Do you like to have the buyer's agent there as well or not? Is it necessary for them to be there?
Not necessary. It doesn't matter. It's whatever they feel comfortable with. New agents, I was with one Saturday and it was great. She followed me around in the crawl space up in the attic, and she wanted to learn. And I like that because I like to teach. So it was a little small house and it took a full 3 hours, but I was investing in her because she wanted to learn. Anybody that wants to learn, I want to teach, So she'll be a very knowledgeable agent in the future. Will she continue? I don't know. It's hard to say, but once she gets that information, then she'll know at that point when she can or can't be there. But I always say that if they can't be there, and I know real estate agents are busy showing houses and things like that, and sometimes they can't be there. In that case, they can call me afterwards if they've got any questions. We'll always be happy to clarify or to explain what we found. So, right? This let's look at what is included in a home inspection. Visual items like walls, windows, floors, attic, basements, exterior, anything that we can see in closets. This is a funny thing when you do enough inspections, and this didn't happen to me, but the guy forgot to look up inside the closet. There was no ceiling to it. And somebody said, how could you miss it? Well, that didn't happen to me, but guess what? When I go in, I look up, make sure there's a ceiling in the closet. Or sometimes I've forgotten something, and if I've missed something in the past, it's burned in my memory now. So we're always looking for things that you see. Then there are those, well, I'll get into that in a second, but it's what we're looking for are the visual items that we can see. And I've got a real strong flashlight, and I really like using that to tell, to see what we can actually see. But I like to, if I can, go a little beyond what we can't see. And that's when we use thermal imaging cameras. When I do a home inspection, I'll do a thermal imaging camera at the end, just to make sure there are no leaks from, like I'm in a house right now that I inspected. It's a single level, new roof, no issues. I put a thermal imaging on there just to make sure that the roof wasn't leaking. Because sometimes you look up and you see absolutely nothing out of order, but when you leave, there's a wet spot. Why? Because it was a small leak, might be raining or something like that. But then when you leave, it just continues to get bigger, and you go, how did you miss that? Well, so that's why I like to use a thermal imaging camera to see if there are things that we wouldn't normally be able to see, and we can. And I always like to say, I like to see the invisible, but not the paranormal. That's something I don't want to see. So, but what we're looking for, visual items like I said, walls, windows, and floors. We're also looking inside the electrical panel, the furnace unit, especially if it's a gas furnace, to see if there's any rust in their burners. Looking for the age as well, and anything that's, of course, operation as well. We're looking at the water heater. We're looking at all the appliances to make sure that they work. We're also evaluating them based on age, looking at the garage door to see if the safety items are there and if they're in proper working order. Like I said, safety issues is one thing we're always looking for, and structural issues. Is the attic braced properly? Do they have the proper bracing down in the on the walls in the basement or something like that? Those are things we're looking for, safety and structure. We're also looking for, visual items like the roof, exterior, siding, slope conditions. Does water flow toward the house or away from the house? We're looking for deck safety. That's very important. We're looking for moisture intrusion, deterioration of wood, whether it be in a crawl space or it could be a slab even. But we're looking at windows and doors. Windows, we're looking at, is there moisture damage around the window frames? Do the windows open properly? That's important, because if a window doesn't open properly in a bedroom, then you have no safety egress in case of a fire. We're looking for settling. When we're doing an inspection, I'm looking to see if there are issues with settling. And one way that can show up is, well, you can feel the slope in the floor, and another, you can see cracks in the walls, especially around the doors and things like that, or a door doesn't close or doors don't close. So those are things we're looking for, settling issues. Let's talk about what's not included in a home inspection. Some of the things that are not included are hidden issues. Sometimes things can be hidden because, well, they can't be seen, or they were masked and you can't see them. Maybe insulation covered up something and you can't see it. It wasn't visible. We don't do load calculations for structural items. Now, I will say, especially on a deck, I'm looking to see the spacing, and if is it a 2x8 or 2x10 or a 2x6, and how far I can tell that. But generally, I'm not going to say, oh, everything in the house is framed well, and the load calculations we don't do that. We don't do calculations to make sure the heating and air conditioning, the air conditioning system, is it properly sized? Does it meet, because those require a different type of inspection, and that would be load calculations. All the windows and things like that have to be taken into account, and how many rooms, square footage, and things like that. That's something that's not included in a general visual home inspection. We do offer if you want load calculations and things like the technical inspection, but they're expensive to do because you're bringing in the trades, and I'm not the primary inspector at that point. I'm more of a project manager. but that is available. But for the most part, it's pretty adequate. I will say this has happened a couple of times where I can tell that there are 3 levels, that there's only two air conditioning systems. So one level doesn't have it. Usually it's the unfinished basement or finished basement, but they don't have any heating and air conditioning ducts. There's no distribution system. There's no supply and return. So, you can tell at that point, and I would bring that up in a report, that 3 levels, it appears that one level is not properly heated and cooled. So, I've had things like that happen. I will say, although we don't do load calculations, I do look at the supply air coming in and then the return air that goes out. The supply air goes into the house, eventually warms up. That's why you have the air conditioner, because it's hot. So that cold air is supplying the room with cold air, but as it warms up, then it goes through the return. That return air goes to the compressor and then it comes back out as cold air. So it's always recirculating. And so the supply air actually should be colder than the return air. They're 2 different systems. They're 2 different duct systems. But I will test the difference between the supply and return air. And if it's 14, 22 degrees different between the 2, then it's working in operational range. If it's not, then I have an indication that there's an issue with either the evaporator coil or there's not enough refrigerant in the lines. But so we don't do load calculations, but we do calculations or tests to see if it's working in normal operating proper order.
Hey, Oby, when it comes to HVAC and furnace, what's the temperature? Because sometimes I see on my reports, was not able to test the furnace or was not able to test the air. So what's the temperature difference, and where is it that you can't, and why can't you do both?
That's a great question. Thank you, Julianne. 65 degrees is a question, is kind of the point. And when I first started inspecting, I thought, it feels nice outside. But I've talked to HVAC people, technicians, they go, no, 65 degrees. You don't want to test an air conditioner below 65, because what it can happen is actually, because there's a pressurized system, actually with the lower temperatures, it could freeze up the system. You can get frost on it, it could freeze up, and it could damage the compressor. So generally, you don't inspect an air conditioning system below 65. And with a heat pump, you don't inspect a heater, which is actually an electric heater, but you don't test that above 65. So there's you have to now let me explain something there. I was doing an inspection once, and the person said, hold on one moment. Excuse me. There we go. Sorry about that. One person said, look, I manufacture these things, and I know you can test them. You can't run them, but you can test them. And I said, agreed. However, if I damage the system for whatever reason, and they said, well, where's the line between testing and running? There's no line. So I think as far as liability is concerned, really, or really not wanting to damage the system, 65 degrees is generally. Now, having said that, if I'll look on my phone and I'll see what the temperature is for Marietta. And if it's 64 degrees, 63 degrees, then I'll get my thermal imaging camera and I'll go outside to in the house and see what the ambient temperature is outside right where I am. And if it's 65 degrees, then I will test it. But I always like to make sure that, that I know what that temperature is at the house where I am before doing that. So a little bit about heating and air. Let's see. Generally, we don't report on the quality of workmanship. And I had this happen just the other day, and yeah, it wasn't done really nicely. It was not a good job. It's what I call brother-in-law construction, you know, where they had the brother-in-law and themselves come over and they did it. Now, if it's defective, that's one thing, but if it's just not really done well, yeah, we don't generally report on that unless it bumps into safety or structure or something like that. Another thing that we generally don't, if it's like a cosmetic item, if there's a scratch on the wall, you know, you can see it. Now, if there's a number of them, there's a threshold to me. If there are holes, I generally don't start doing that. But I will, no, let me say this. If like a doorknob creates a hole in the wall, I'll take a picture of that, you know, because that's a repair that's, you know, should be done. But generally, if they didn't do a good paint job, or, you know, that's quality of workmanship. Sloppy paint jobs are not something we generally report on either. But like I said, if it's something, if there's some scratches on the wall or nail holes or things like that, we generally don't do that unless it's to a certain degree where it's just really bad and it's going to require a lot of work. Then we would report on that. But generally, cosmetic items are not in the report. It just, in my mind, I'm thinking of what's it going to take for this person to have to do that. If they have to paint all of the inside because it's in such bad condition, then I will put that on the report. Let's talk about codes. Generally, the seller is not required to bring it up to code. You have a house that was built in 1985, and those, you know, there are a lot of safety improvements since then, like GFCIs, and you know, you have a drive under garage, and there are no, you know, there's no sheetrock, so there's no fire protection. Later on, they started putting in sprinklers and things like that. So that's helpful, but generally not supposed to bring it up. They don't have to bring it up to code. I will put things in there. And my philosophy is this. I don't want something to happen and someone say, I wish you had told me. You know, so I'm going to put in safety recommendations. And the recommendations, let's talk about the drive under garage that has no fire protection. If there's a car catches on fire, there's no protection. All of that flame goes right onto the floor system and right into the living area. And so if I see an older home like that, I'm going to recommend that you either sheetrock it, create a fireproof envelope, which is what code is today, or put in sprinkler systems, which are very effective. And then if there's a fire, then that gives you at least 1 hour protection. So those are some of the things I'll put in there, but generally those are a safety item. But generally, I'm not going to say, this is generally in a, well, general home inspection, we don't say, you know, what is code. We don't generally state the code. We may know what it is, but when you get into code arguments or when it was code, when it wasn't, we don't really get into those kind of things. But like I said, when it comes to code, especially, let's talk about decks. When you have, you know, is this up to code? Well, if it was built in 1985, there are a lot of safety improvements since 1985. And sometimes I will recommend a deck person come out to evaluate for safety, especially if there are like 6 or 7 things that are all of a sudden, you know, there's a lot of them because of the age of the house. Then in that regard, I will just recommend, hey, come out and recommend somebody evaluate the deck. But I generally would put on something like, oh, there's no flashing, it's not bolted in, there's a lot of space between the railing where somebody could fall through. I'm going to bring those up because I do know what the codes are, but I'm going to bring them up as a safety issue, not a code issue. Yeah, in general, what we're looking for when we're doing a house is safety, structure, expensive to repair. That's what we're looking for in a house. And myself and Cornell, when we do a home inspection, we always at the end, I want to know this. Do I know this house well? Do I know maybe what problems it might have had that have been repaired? Okay. But do I understand the house well so that when I'm explaining it to the homeowner, I can say, this is what I know about the house. I did a pre-sale inspection last week. He was going to put it on the market, and he wanted a home inspection done. I don't know why, because he was meticulous about the house. That's probably why, is because he's meticulous. But I finished the inspection and I said, now I've found some things, but this house is really in good condition. However, I've only been here 2.5 hours and you've lived in here for 5 years. Is there something that you know about that I maybe have not seen? There may be this or that. In that case, there wasn't, but most of the time we're finding things they weren't aware of. But I always like to ask that question to who, if they're selling the house, especially like a pre-sale, just because of that. Or I'll do that with a renter. If the renter is in there and they said, why are you here? And it's generally, it's an annual inspection that we're doing, and they've never done an annual inspection. So, that's what I will say. That's all I say. And now you've lived in the house. Is there something that's specific that you want to point out? That's good information, and usually it's something I've found out anyway. More likely, I've found things they didn't know about too. That's generally it.
What about expansion tanks, Oby?
Yeah, that's a good question. Expansion tanks are actually air bladders. There's a bladder inside, and the reason why you have that is because when you have, most houses today have a pressure reducer valve, and that valve is set at 55 psi. Now, if there's for some reason too much pressure, like when you're running the water, everything's fine, but when you turn that water off, like at a tub, pressure builds up in the lines. If there's too much pressure in the house, then it can cause those, let's say if you have copper, it can cause it to shake. And if it shakes too much, and you've probably heard that from time to time, where you hear just banging throughout the house. That's those water pipes are shaking. And what happens is eventually, because those joints are soldered together, then it can break those joints and they can cause a leak. So the code now is that a water heater should have a thermal tank or an expansion tank is what it's called. And what happens is if pressure builds up, rather than building up in the lines, it builds up in the tank, normalizes in the tank and keeps the pressure off of the lines. I think it's important. They do have about a 5-year life. I think it's always good to tap on it. If it feels like, if you tap on it and it has a real tinny sound to it, it's good. But if you tap on it and it sounds real thick, like just a thud, then it can get waterlogged, especially if it's on its side. It can get waterlogged, and then it's not doing what it's intended to do, and should be replaced. But if it's standing upright, generally it's allowed to drain. But it is an air bladder, and it is required by code. And even if it's I did one the other day, it was an older water heater, and I think it was old. It was 15 years old. Didn't have one, but I put it in there I just said, it does not have, even though it probably wasn't required then, I put that it doesn't have an expansion tank.
So you said that the houses don't have to be brought up to code. So is that one of the situations where it doesn't have to be brought up to code, but if you switch out the water heater, then it does have to be brought up to code?
That's exactly right. If someone today replaces it, now I have seen this where brother-in-law goes in and puts in a new water heater and doesn't put in a thermal tank. That's not perhaps when this house was built, wasn't required. That's one of those, it is required and is missing. So it's interesting because there are two sides of home inspection. There's the technical side, and that's when you're looking for, the technical issues, but then there's also what I call the art of it. And that is the things that are not there that should be. For example, you're going up and down the stairs inside the house and you suddenly realize, there are no handrails here. There should be handrails. And that's where the art of capturing those kind of things, that there's no handrail, where it's not there, it should be. So that's what we're striving for, is looking for those things that are there that we can see, but also those things that are not there that we put in the report.
Awesome. Thank you, Oby. So give us an idea of what are some very common things that you see in most houses. I'm thinking of flashing on the deck. I mean, that comes up, I think, on every single report that I've ever seen. What are some other things that you see that's really common so that they don't freak out when they see it, right?
Yeah, good question. Let's see. A lot of times I will say common things is, let's say a house is remodeled. Well, let's see if this answers your question. House has been remodeled. I'm in one right now. Fortunately, the electrical was done well, but the receptacles that are 6 feet away from water are GFCI, but there's some over on another counter and they're not. If it's a kitchen, if it's a counter, it's supposed to be GFCI. One of the things that changed with that requirement later on in the codes is that the laundry room, there's usually a receptacle that's right next to the water source. It's supposed to be GFCI. I see that a lot too. Maybe it wasn't required when that home was built, because I think this has been in the last 7 years that was made a requirement. So anything older than 7 years, now for me, I put it in as a safety recommendation, just so they know, because if they wanted to come in and get something fixed, then they would. Let's see, some other things, got to be plumbing related, because plumbing is, I love indoor plumbing until it goes bad. A lot of times I will see in the drain system of a sink, it might not have a P-trap. And a P-trap is designed, it goes, I can't see my hands, but it has this kind of, it goes down and then goes up. So when you're running the water flows out, but when you stop, water is left in that drain. And the reason why it's left in that drain is so that sewer gases can't come up inside the drain. So sometimes I see the P-trap is located in the basement. Well, the problem with that is when you're running water, enough of it could be forced out to where it's not trapping the water. Let's talk about drains. Another thing I see are those accordion type drains where it wasn't quite lined up, so they'll get this tubing and you can shape any size and you can fit one pipe to the other. Well, it'll drain, but the problem with that, especially in a bathroom, well, sometimes I'll see it in a sink where there's a disposal. The problem with it is because it's accordion shaped, it's going to trap debris, hair or food or something like that. And then it will start clogging. And if you try to put some kind of one of those little pullers, something like that, if you try to do something like that, it's going to tear it. those flex tubings are great for RVs, but not for a home. The plumbing, the code requires solid piping, whether it be PVC or chrome or something like that. Common to a home.
How about the exhaust fans in the bathrooms exhausting into the attic?
Good idea. Yes. Yes. I think, well, let me say, the bath vents are supposed to be vented to the outside because there's a lot of humidity, a lot of moisture that gets clogged up in the, I'm sorry, my phone just went off. I'm trying to keep it quiet. There's a lot of moisture and air that actually can continue to build up with that fan going. And quite honestly, in my shower, in my bathroom, I have it timed for 30 minutes. So it can be running long after we've taken a shower, and all that moisture is just going up into the attic, which can create mold and mildew. One very common thing I see is, you've got all this insulation up in the attic, and you see the vent fan, but I see no place where it goes. I'm looking at the eaves, and I don't see where it doesn't vent to the outside. So that tells me that they took the hose, the pipe, the flexible tubing, the flexible pipe, and they just run it to the soffit. That may be a continuous vent, or there may be a vent there. And that's not adequate either, because now what you're doing is, especially if it's wood, you're just introducing moisture and humidity to this wood piece that's eventually going to rot. So it actually should be vented to the outside. So when I'm going around the house and I see those vents that are vented to the outside, well, that will tell me that it is vented. If I don't see them, but I see the piping, then that tells me they just put it right on top of the soffit. So not it. That's a good question. That's pretty common.
Yeah, I see that one. That's on almost every single report. That and the flashing. Talk about the deck flashing, because I don't think a lot of people even understand what that is.
No, that's a great point. When you're framing a house, you have a house band, and like, let's say they build a concrete wall or the masonry block wall, and now they're going to start their framing. What they'll do is they'll have two 2x10s, which is called a house band. And that's where the joists sit on, and that's kind of it's a very important part of the house, the floor structure. Eventually, they may put siding on there, and then eventually they'll put the deck on, and they'll either nail it, which they shouldn't be doing now, or bolt it, and that's fine. If they bolt it, that's good. The problem with that is they don't put flashing, which is sheet metal that should go underneath. It should actually go behind the lap siding, whether it be cement or hardboard, should go behind it, and then down below the deck structure, and then it should come out underneath, so that if any rain comes hits that transition point where the siding comes down and you've got your deck, that water should not hit the house band, but should go underneath, actually behind it, and be able to drip away. A friend of mine he was going to do some deck repair, and as they started taking pieces off, they realized he had hardboard siding, and that deck band had been completely, in some places, it was pretty much gone. It was just rotten. And so what happens then, if you have a party, you get people out on that deck, it's going to fall. It's just going to pull away from the house, and actually could fall. And that happened to a friend of mine, actually. It was in where the deck fell down. So that's one of the common ways a deck is going to fail, is falling, getting pulled away, because nothing's holding it in place at that point. So they had to go in and repair the deck bands and then reattach it. So a flashing, and then when I do a report, I'll show a picture that says there's no deck flashing, and then I'll have a picture of what it's supposed to look like to explain, that what I just said, because even explaining it verbally may not make sense, but when you see it in the picture, what it's supposed to look like. So you're actually protecting the major structure of the floor system.
Thank you. So if anybody has any questions, please chime in either on the chat bar or unmute yourself and you can ask Oby a question. In the meantime, I'm just going to ask him questions because I see enough of these reports that I think I know some things that definitely come up. So in your opinion, Oby, what are the 3 main things that are the biggest concerns for a house?
I will say masonry block walls, because they're very porous. They tend to settle and then they tend to crack. And
You're talking about in the basement, right? The
basement.
blocks, the cinder blocks?
Now, I will say I've built both. I used to build houses. I used to build both, and I've done. I say both. I used to do the concrete block, the concrete poured walls, and I've done masonry walls. And the masonry walls, you know, like I said, they're porous, and generally when they're being built afterwards, then they go in and they'll roll tar on it as a waterproofing agent, and that's good. But because it's so porous, a lot of times it can find its way in, and it's usually at that very bottom piece where it meets the footing, or right there at the footing in that first block. That's where it usually goes in. And I can tell if there's moisture intrusion by 2 ways. One is where the blocks are damp, and number 2, there's a white paint that you can put on. I'm drawing a blank. It's a hydrostatic paint. I knew it wasn't electrostatic. Hydrostatic paint, which does resist some moisture intrusion. But what happens if there's a lot of water coming in, then it starts to peel. And when it's peeling, that's a telltale sign that you're having, it may not be water intrusion, but you're getting, the blocks are getting wet, and that's where you find settling. I would say in a poured concrete wall, what they do is they'll build a foundation. There's a lot of 1/2-inch rebar that is bent and tied together, and it looks like a little skeleton of a wall. They'll put up metal panels on each side of the footing that might be, say, 8 feet or 8.5 feet or 9, and then they will lock them together and pour. They'll just get concrete truck and they'll pour that wall, and then eventually they'll remove the panels, and then you've got this concrete poured wall that's got a lot of steel, a lot of compression, and a lot of compaction strength. So you can see cracks in them in a poured wall. You can see cracks, but they're generally not issues unless you want to just keep them sealed. So one of the, now, some of the other things that I've seen with one big thing with a house is negative slope toward the house. Negative slope means the water is going toward the house instead of away from it. Or it could be, if you have a crawl space, that's just very level. Because when you get a heavy rain coming in from one side, it's very level. Eventually all that water is going to eventually settle against that concrete foundation, which is usually a masonry block wall, and then you get water intrusion into the crawl space. So it's very important. Number 1 is to keep the gutters clean. Let's have gutters and downspouts if you have a crawl space, especially. Have gutters and downspouts. Make sure that they're clean, and make sure you divert water away from the house. And some people say 3 feet. I just say is enough to where, and you can get that black pipe at Home Depot, but divert water, just connect it to the downspout and make sure that you can keep that water away from the foundation, because in a heavy rain with the right kind of roof, you can get 600 gallons of water out of that downspout, which is a lot of water against the house. It's going right into the crawl space, could go into the crawl space. And then sometimes I'll see where they have a sump pump because nothing they can apparently do. And so they just pump water out, but that's still not a good idea because water is going in either under the footings or it's going into the through the blocks. So that's another issue I see. Diverting water away from the house. Now, diverting water can just simply be landscaping. If you berm, which means you build up and create a way for it to flow, maybe put plants up there and that'll hold it in place, then when that rain hits it in a certain direction, it flows away from from the house. If there's not enough space, then maybe a French drain. You can put a French drain in there to divert water away. But those are landscaping ways of getting water away, keeping water away from the crawl space or the foundation. And even if you have a slab, sometimes you can see erosion at the corner, because they don't have water diverted away from the house. I did do an inspection where I walked into it was a slab, and I walked into the dining room, and you could really feel the slope, and then you could see the cracks in the walls by the door and the window, and you could tell that the slab had actually cracked and was settling. So always a good idea to keep water away from the foundation.
So Oby, tell us, do you think it's important to have an inspection on new construction? I mean, there's nothing that would be wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, they're easier to do. I will say that for some of the national builders, they have quality teams, and they go in and they find, they're looking for things too. And sometimes I can see that they've already gone through and done their checks. So it's not as much, but because, well, let's say this. I did a home inspection in Decatur, and it was a very upscale place, and they had a wolf stove oven, and it didn't work. And the guy goes, "No, it's got to work. It's wolf." And I said, "Well, you can try it." And he was the agent, and he was trying, and he said, "You're right, it doesn't work." Well, as long as there's a warranty, that's fine, but that's an expensive piece of equipment. So I will say that for some of the local builders, and I used to be one, I hate to say that, but we didn't have a quality team, but we did the best we could to check and everything, but it's only as good as it's supervised. And I am sometimes by default, the quality control department for some of the local builders. I think mostly what I find in new construction deficiencies, where you've got a main beam running through the house, you've got your floor joist, and they have the brackets, the structural brackets that hold the joist to the beam, and they will maybe put 5 or 6 nails on each side, which is not enough. Cherokee County and Forsyth County require all holes to be filled with those nails, and because that's the floor structure of the house. You could have a piano in that room, and that could cause a problem. So those are some of the things that I find, but I would say new construction is generally what it is. A lot of people just want to know before they cover it up, is it okay? And normally it is. I will say sometimes I do find some of the engineered trusses broken where they tried to where they installed the heating unit at the beginning. I'll find something like that, but those can be repaired. But so to answer your question, yeah, generally I don't, but it's always a good idea to find, have it inspected at some point, because if the house is, let's say, 4 or 5 years old, my question is, I wonder if it's ever been inspected, because then I'm looking for, is it sagging? There was a neighborhood in Cumming where the guy went bankrupt, and there were some real issues where it had sagging going on because it wasn't framed properly. And you couldn't see it because of the sheetrock and everything, but you could see it, and you could see the sagging, and you could tell it was starting to get worse and worse. So
You bet.
to answer your question, I think it's always a good idea.
It is, absolutely. And so when you do, I encourage all my clients to do it twice, to do it pre-drywall and then right before. And all that inspection report is just handed to the builder because they should fix everything. So what's the normal cost for an inspection, and do you re-inspect? Let's say it's something that the owner or the buyer or the agent wouldn't know if it was fixed or fixed properly. Do you go back and re-inspect?
I do. Let's see, what was your first question? I'm sorry. Your first question was
About cost.
yeah. Actually, I did well, ours is generally probably 365 to 400, depending on the size and the age of the house. And even if a house is, like I'm in one now that's 85 years old and it's been renovated, but I did find some structural issues, with the house, and they wouldn't have known that. So, and sometimes you see that the electrical panels might have issues in an older house, especially because they've had time to remodel over the years. So things like that. Generally, it's square footage and age. We're very competitive on our price. Our goal is to be very thorough and not to alarm, but to inform. Because, and here's a funny thing about that. I did a home that the siding was horrible. And I don't usually call it poor, but I mean, it was on all four sides. It was horrible. So I just want to make sure I documented all four sides, and I said, it's poor. And like I said, don't normally do that. But the guy came up, and the customer, he had his logo on his shirt, his Nelson siding. So, that's he knew about that. That was something, it's no problem, I can take care of that, So, I always just kind of put what I find. It's a snapshot, and, make value judgments on it, because one guy was an electrician who had electrical problems. Oh, that's okay. That's not a problem. So it's things like that. There's a reason why they're buying a house. I just want to make sure that I do a snapshot of what I find today. Even if they say, we're going to gut this whole floor. That's fine. Today it's here, and this is what I'm going to. Now you have a scope of work.
And then do you do re-inspections?
Oh, yes. Thank you. We do. There's a charge for it. Normally it's 125 to 150. It's like for 1 to 2 elements. If you give me a list of, I'm not going to say I'm going to go there and just inspect one thing like the electrical. But what I generally like to do is, whatever the amendments were that were promised to be fixed, I like to just go through the list. That takes a little longer, but that's why they want us there, is to make sure that it was done properly. I did that the other day in a unit where he gave me a list. Actually, he gave me pictures of the defects, and then I was able to check them and say, yeah, they were done correctly. Uh-oh, I don't hear you.
I've got a question.
Okay.
What are some scenarios that you would have, or that you would suggest that a professional, like an HVAC inspector, come in, or somebody that needs to get more detailed?
Good question. Let's start with the least amount and go to the highest. Let's say if I see a furnace unit that is 10 years old, might have some rust in it. And I'm going to recommend evaluation by a qualified HVAC contractor, because what we want him to look at is the heat exchanger to see if there's any rust in their burners. Because if there's, over time, it's possible that they can crack. And if they do, they're going to release carbon monoxide. So because of that, I always recommend, in my report, it says, recommend the heat exchanger be examined every 5 years. But if it's, the design life is 10 to 12, and it can last longer than that, but the design life is 10 to 12. And I'm gonna say rated fair because of age. Let's say it worked well, everything was okay. I'm just gonna say rated fair because of age and lack of absence of maintenance records. and recommend examining the heat exchanger every 5 years. Then the next thing I'm going to look for is if I don't get 14 degrees between the cold air and the return air, then it tells me that it's either refrigerant is low or the evaporator coils are not working properly. Sometimes it can be as simple as a thermostat. You know, I mean, if the thermostat's not operable, then I can't test the system. Hate that. It's simple, but that's generally what I'm looking for is age of it and the temperature. I will say too, let me say one other thing. Marla, when if there's a crawl space and if I see rodents, you know, evidence of rodent activity, I'm going to really check the distribution systems, the vents, to check the temperatures in all of the house, because it's possible with rodents that they can get in there. If it's the flexible vent or flexible duct, then they can get in there. They like to make a home in there. So.
Sorry, yeah, that's never a good thing. So in summary, you need to be able to reach the items that you're going to inspect. So the house needs to be clean and things need to be accessible, because you don't move furniture, right? You don't move things. No inspector is going to do that, right?
Right. You know, like a refrigerator, you know, they're not going to pull it out to test the outlet or anything like that. It's you know, you damage the floor. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Oby, we appreciate your time, and I'm glad that you were able to do this by Zoom because it allows you to work even more efficiently, right?
I know, but the only problem is you couldn't see my hands. My hands are doing all this with
Right.
just down there.
That's okay. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate you being a vendor with us at the office. You do great inspections. You've done them for me, and I really appreciate it. If you have any other questions, Oby is a vendor in our office, so you can access his information on our Quan intranet, and check in with him. He'll be glad to do an inspection for you, right, Oby?
I will. In fact, let me give you my cell phone number, because my business card has the office. Now, I will say this: if you need an inspection, the best way, you can call me, but I'm going to say, if you will check with my office, because right now while I'm doing this, I might have had my calendar may have changed. If you're in, and I also have a thing, it's called the real estate dashboard that I can send you a text and you download that. It's a link, and then you can see what my schedule is, and then you can actually put something on there that says, oh, hey, I want this time slot. I'll call all the details into the office. And then you can also, in that little dashboard, so you can see everything, all the inspections I've ever done for you. And it's kind of right there. So, but let me give you my cell phone number. If you've got more questions, I'll be happy to answer them. That's 770-329-4424.
Say it again, 770-329-4424.
329-4424.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Oby.
No, thank you.
Those of you that are here, I'll look forward to seeing you all at 1 o'clock when I'm going to be demonstrating a buyer consultation. So you don't want to miss that. All right.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much, Oby, and everybody. We'll see you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.